Well, good morning. I'm Terence Russell, and it's a pleasure to be with you today. And our Bible reading today is from Matthew's Gospel, chapter 14, verses 22 to 23. And we're continuing our summer journey through Matthew. And today we're looking at Jesus walking on water. Matthew 14, verses 22 to 33. And I'm reading from the English Standard Version. Immediately he made the disciples get into the boat and go before him to the other side, while he dismissed the crowds. And after he dismissed the crowds, he went up on the mountain by himself to pray. When evening came, he was there alone. But the boat by this time was a long way from the land, beaten by the waves, for the wind was against them. And in the fourth watch of the night he came to them, walking on the sea. But when the disciples saw him walking on the sea, they were terrified and said, "It's a ghost!" And they cried out in fear. But immediately Jesus spoke to them, saying, "Take heart, it is I, do not be afraid." And Peter answered him, "Lord, if it's you, command me to come to you on the water." He said, "Come." So Peter got out of the boat and walked on the water and came to Jesus. But when he saw the wind, he was afraid, and beginning to sink, he cried out, "Lord, save me." Jesus immediately reached out his hand and took hold of him, saying to him, "O you of little faith, why did you doubt?" And when they got into the boat, the wind ceased, and those in the boat worshipped him, saying, "Truly, you are the Son of God." Well, today we're going to be looking at that passage from Matthew 14 under the title, Faith Over Fear. Faith over fear. Well, I suspect we'd all like our faith to be that little bit stronger. If you're like me, you'll be a shifting mix of faith, fears and doubts. Some days our faith seems strong, other days our fears and doubts seem to be in control. A little bit of bad news can really knock us for six. Well, Jesus' disciples were no different. They'd just seen Jesus do something amazing. He'd fed 5,000 people from just a few scraps. And you might have thought that their faith in Jesus would be sky high. But as we'll see, they exhibit this same mixture of faith, fears, and doubts. It's why Jesus then performs another miracle. It's to give them an unmistakable sign of who he is, the Son of God, who has control over everything. And therefore they and we can and should place our total trust in him. But as we all know, it's easier said than done. So today we're going to use this episode of Jesus walking on water to examine this perennial battle we have between our faith and our fear, and what we can learn from this passage so that our faith comes out on top. Beginning with what it means to have total faith and trust in Jesus. Well, I used to fly small aeroplanes. I used to have a private pilot's license. And there's various levels to having a private pilot's license. The first basic level is just by flying by sight alone, through looking out of the cockpit window. And you're only allowed to fly if it's good visibility. And the second, more advanced, the next level up, is flying by instruments. So you can fly and land in very bad weather. And when I was learning, I remember having a few basic but vital things drummed into me by my instructor. And the first, and we'll look at three today, was faith and trust. Having total faith and trust in your instruments. That's your best security, especially as the weather is bad. Well, Jesus calls us to have this same total trust in him as pilots need to have in their instruments. After feeding the 5,000, Jesus tells the disciples in verses 22 to 26 of our passage to go ahead of him and row to the other side of the Sea of Galilee. He actually wants to escape the crowds who've misunderstood what he came to do and want to sort of crown him an earthly king. And the disciples duly set off. They row on the Sea of Galilee, but are soon overwhelmed by a storm that can easily whip up there. And that sea is renowned for storms that easily come and go very quickly. And then after a while, Jesus goes to them by walking on the lake. And this story is all about strengthening theirs and our faith in him. The first thing we learn from this is that Jesus is teaching the disciples that our lives are not storm or trouble free. Indeed, he sends them into the storm. He knew there was a storm coming. Following Jesus is not always easy. But, and it's a big but, it's far better to be in the storm with Jesus than in comparative calm, but without him and trying to operate in our own strength. We shouldn't think, I can't be in God's plan if I'm struggling. Sometimes we actually have to go through a storm or a struggle to strengthen our faith. Jesus doesn't always quell and quash the storm that we're in, but he does do something else, as we see here. He shows he's there. But secondly, Jesus comes to the disciples by walking on water. And that word comes is crucial. And it actually features twice in this story, as we'll see. But note that Jesus waits till the disciples are as far from the shore as they could be, and the storm is at its worst. Jesus comes to them only when they reach the point of maximum dependency on him. Not because he wants them to suffer, he loves them dearly, but because he wants them to place their faith, trust, and security in him alone, as the future of his church is going to rest on their shoulders. Soon after I came to faith, I spent some time in Israel. It was actually quite a violent period in the Israeli-Arab conflict. But I went there because I felt a strong call from the Lord to do so. He really placed a strong prompting on my heart. And it turned out to be quite a test of my faith and trust in the Lord. And I remember a time when I was staying up in Haifa, a city in the north of Israel. And one day I felt the Lord prompt in my spirit to change my normal daily route that I was taking each day. And then a bomb went off at the place and exact time what I would have normally have been. And it was quite a lesson to me in how Jesus watches over us even when we're in his will. He can seem far off, but he's watching. And it was the same with the disciples. They were in a storm precisely because they'd been obedient to Jesus. But as with me then, Jesus brought them there. But we'll only be obedient if we have total trust in Jesus. The two go together. And if we're following him, we can expect him to be there for us, even if all seems lost. It's a matter of where we place our security. And as Romans 8:34 reminds us, he's always interceding for us at the right hand of the Father. But the interesting thing is the disciples' reaction. Given they were in a storm, had seen Jesus perform miracles, and then saw Jesus coming towards them, you might have thought they'd be relieved. But no. They assumed it was a ghost and were gripped with fear. Why? Well, the problem was they weren't looking for Jesus, and their expectations of him were too low. And we can be the same. We can be looking for help in the wrong places. Have low expectations of what Jesus can do for us. Well, think about what causes you to have lower expectations of Jesus. So we've seen that Jesus calls us to trust him unreservedly, even in the storms of life, to know our securities in him and to expect him to be there for us. But there's a problem. Our fears and doubts can then undermine our faith. And that's our next theme as we look now at the example of Peter in our story. Verse 27 to 30. Jesus immediately seeks to reassure him. He says, "Take heart, it is I, do not be afraid." Then Peter answered him, "Lord, if it's you, command me to come to you on the water." He said, "Come." So Peter got out of the boat and walked on the water and came to Jesus. But when he saw the wind, he was afraid, and beginning to sink, he cried out, "Lord, save me." It's that mix of faith and fear I referred to at the start. And interestingly, it all hinges again on the word come. Jesus came to the disciples on the water, and now he tells Peter to come to him on the water. In fact, Jesus makes it so simple to follow him. He removes all the barriers and just says, "Come to me." And it's we who so often erect the barriers and make excuses for why we can't come to him. But Jesus is teaching that if he says come, he will see us through whatever our doubts. But we have to take that first step and trust him. And I can really identify with this word come, because that was actually key in my accepting Jesus. My journey took several years, and for the final 3 months I was really sitting on the fence. Did I really believe? What would the consequences be? And then one evening, I was sitting in my lounge, and I just had this powerful image of Jesus at the other end of the room, just beckoning me, saying, "Come." And at that moment, I decided to get off the fence, stop making excuses, and come to him. And my life was transformed. I was Jewish background. I never imagined that I'd become a Church of England clergy person. But I had to take that step of faith when Jesus said, "Come." And then unimaginable things at the time became possible. But I then had to follow through. And it was the same for Peter. He had to take that initial step out of the boat into the water. And when he did, he could walk, and all went well. But then something happened. He let fear get the better of him. And it's that fear that stops us following through, even when we've taken that initial step. And fear is one of the most powerful emotions that we can experience. It grips us. You get that knot in the stomach feeling. It can sort of numb your brain, just stop you in your tracks. It can be the fear of the unknown, fear of rejection, fear of ridicule. And it can be anything. Asking someone out for a date, public speaking, talking about your faith openly to non-believers. But to be free from fear has got to be replaced by something stronger. And only our love for and trust in God can truly conquer our fear and doubts. And Isaiah 41, verse 10 in the Old Testament sums this up well. "Do not fear, for I am with you. Do not be dismayed, for I am your God. I will strengthen you and help you. I will uphold you." But it requires total trust from us and keeping our eyes fixed on Jesus at all times. That's what Peter had to do. All fine when he did, but as soon as he took his eyes off Jesus and started focusing on the waves and the wind instead, fear took over and he started to sink. When I was learning to fly, they taught me two other things alongside trust your instruments totally. The second was keep your eyes fixed on those instruments at all times. And they even put a long peaked cap over me when I was learning like this. So I was forced just to look at the controls the whole time and not look out the window. And the third was little and often make constant tiny adjustments on the control in the response to the instruments in order to stay on track, especially when you're flying in sort of rough weather. And I quickly learned that if I took my eyes off the instruments, fear could quickly set in. Well, as with flying, what Peter had to do was keep his eyes on Jesus at all times. and then make tiny adjustments as he walked on the rolling waves. That way, he'd be able to go straight to Jesus and stay on track. And it's the same with us. We're always going to be faced with things and distractions that can knock us off the path of following Jesus. The thing is to be alert to them and then make small adjustments. And it's so much easier to do this than try and then make big major changes periodically. And how do we do this? Well, it's by staying close to Jesus, reading our Bibles daily, avoiding things that we know are going to tempt us and knock us off track, being accountable to someone. So what stops you, perhaps at times, from keeping your eyes fixed on Jesus? And what steps can you take to avoid it? So we've seen first that we're to trust and depend on Jesus implicitly. And second, we're to keep our eyes fixed on Jesus at all times. But sometimes fear will overwhelm us, even when we've stepped out in faith to follow him. What then? Well, that leads to our third and so reassuring final theme. Jesus is always there for us, as we see in verses 31 to 32 of our passage. It's easy to be critical of Peter taking his eyes off Jesus and starting to sink. But remember, he stepped out in faith in the first place. But two interesting things now happen. First, he cried out to Jesus for help. "Lord, save me!" He knew where his security ultimately lay. Sounds obvious, but how many times have we tried to fix things in our own strength when we're in trouble? Especially if it's like in our so-called skill area, where we think we know it all. But Jesus wants us to turn to him when we're in trouble. And secondly, see how Jesus responds. It says, Jesus immediately reached out his hand and took hold of him, saying to him, "O you of little faith, why did you doubt?" And then they got into the boat and the wind ceased. We can get it into our heads that Jesus is some hard taskmaster who won't forgive our dips in faith. But he's there for us. He knows our fears and doubts. He's compassionate. He responded immediately to Peter's cry for help once Peter had stepped out in faith. Such a comforting thing to see. So, to bring this together, over just a few hours, the disciples had a roller coaster faith journey. They and we, in the process, learnt some invaluable faith-building insights. Jesus is the Son of God with unlimited power. He asks us to be obedient, to trust him totally, and keep our eyes fixed on him at all times. But equally, he cares for us, comes to us, and is there for us even when our faith wavers. The disciples took this to heart and went on to do incredible things in founding the early church despite huge opposition. And if we take this to heart too, it will also empower us to do amazing things for him, things we didn't think we could ever do. Amen.